Hello and welcome to News Desk. I'm Melissa Chan.
And I'm Amien Essif.
This week we're doing something a little different. We have author Marcel Dirsus joining us in the studio. He is the author of the new book, How Tyrants Fall and How Nations Survive, which The Economist listed as one of the best books of this year. Welcome to DW, Marcel.
Thank you very much for having me.
And that's why this week we're asking the question, China, Russia, and Iran, how might autocracies end?
And we're not going to just be talking about those three countries. We're going to be talking about authoritarian regimes across the world. We want to hear from you, especially if you live in a country where you consider your ruler a tyrant, you live in an authoritarian regime. We want to hear how you've dealt with that, what you think the prospects are, how long that regime might last, what you have done, if you've done anything to try to see the end of the authoritarian regime. So we definitely want to hear from you. We've already had a lot of comments in our community post. This one from Bazbek Genel. He says, "That is how I would suggest to topple tyrants. Prove that your model is superior, the superior one, and show the population that the tyrant is oppressing." And then Semwaga David, a little bit critical of our post, which we always get, and we love that. "You should have said colonial Western powers are the tyrants, USA, France, England, NATO." But he also discusses in this book colonialism, the kind of effects that had on Africa, on India, and how that influenced tyrannical regimes there. So we're definitely going to be getting into that in our discussion.
Right. And around the table, other than Marcel and Amien, we have Jared Reed and Dustin Hemmerlein, both of them. And they'll be paying extra attention. Well, all of us will try to pay attention to what's happening in chat. Bring in your questions and comments for Marcel. To kick things off, Dustin, as usual, we do have a
poll question for you guys. Exactly. So we are. So you can find that poll question in the chat next to the live stream, in the live chat, and we're asking you guys today: will there be fewer or more autocrats in the next, I think we said 30 years? Obviously, you can answer more. You can answer it's probably the same. You can say more autocracies will fall, so less autocrats in the future. Or you can say autocracies are a necessary evil. Yeah, let us know what you think. And in general, let us know what questions you have. We'll definitely get them here to Marcel.
So, Marcel, just to get things started, how tyrants fall. Can we start with a definition? What do you mean by tyrant? And is that the same as autocrat?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's one that I've also asked myself while writing the book. The reason why I went with tyrant rather than something more specific, let's say kings or personalist dictators or something like that, is because I wanted to cover a broad range of non-democratic leaders that rely on only a small share of the population in order to maintain power, and that use their power not necessarily for the common good, but perhaps for their own ends. And the reason I wanted that is because that allows me to look at kings, theocrats, one-party dictatorships, because I think there's a lot of value in trying to look across those systems.
And so what are autocrats then, as opposed to tyrants?
Yeah, it's very similar. You know, sometimes you hear authoritarian, you hear autocratic, you hear dictators, and so forth. So really, what we're looking at here are systems where you don't have this broad range of the population that leaders have an incentive to look after, but really just a small share. But that can come in multiple forms. So this could be a monarchy, this could be, you know, something like the Iranian system, or it could be a one-party dictatorship, like in China, for example.
Right, and there are actually quite a number of books on this subject, tyrants, autocrats, however you want to call them, Timothy Snyder and Applebaum. Why did you write this book? What did you feel like you could contribute?
I think there are a lot of things that we think about tyrants and that we think about dictators that are wrong. You know, I think there are a lot of myths that we tell ourselves, partly because it's more comfortable for us. So I think a lot of people in our liberal democracies have this impression, for example, of tyrants as being irrational and totally immune to incentive. But that's not reality. And at the same time, a lot of people look towards these dictators and they think that they hold almost unlimited power, right? That they just snap their finger and then their will gets done throughout the entire country. But the reality is that even the leaders in the least democratic systems of government rely on a number of people within that system to maintain power. So absolute power, as it were, this idea of omnipotence is a myth.
In addition to that, what are some other major takeaways, fundamental truths that you arrived at in terms of writing your book?
I think quite a few of the takeaways that I have are a little bit depressing in a sense.
Okay.
But I think, in reality, a lot of this is just about raw power. So yes, propaganda plays a role. It matters how many good outcomes you create for your population and so forth. But ultimately, when you look at the way that these systems survive, a lot of it is simply being stronger than the people that they oppose. And again, that is not something that is a comfortable truth.
One thing that I wonder about is your thoughts in terms of the difference between 21st century tyrants and 20th century tyrants, right? Holding on to power arguably is actually easier now with techno-surveillance. Back in the 20th century, the Stasi, right, the former government of the East German, the former government in East Germany would need people to be actual spies, right? And at some point they were saying at its peak, 1 in 5 East Germans were kind of working for the Stasi in some way, informing on their neighbors, informing on their families. You kind of don't need to do that anymore. You could just sort of tap into someone's phone to do that. So do you think that tyrants today have a better grip on their power than in the past?
I think in some sense they do, but in other ways they don't. So to give you a counterexample, during the Cold War, it was quite common for Western liberal democracies to aid dictators directly, right? And of course, this still happens. It's not like democracies don't work with dictators of any kind now, but it used to be a lot more common in the past during the Cold War. So during the Cold War, sometimes it went as far as reversing military coups against tyrants that had already happened from Europe, which, if you think about it now, that's quite absurd, right? It's difficult to imagine a European country now going somewhere in Central Africa and trying to reverse a coup to put a dictator back into power. So in some sense, things have gotten more difficult, but in other ways, they've also become much easier. And one of the things that you mentioned is repression. So the mechanism through which surveillance works is by decreasing the cost of repression. So if you know who exactly is opposing the regime, and you know who they're talking to, and you know what they're doing, you can be a lot more targeted with the way that you use repression. You don't need to hit as many people. And when you hit a lot of people, there's always the chance of a backlash. So that's why targeted repression is usually preferable. And of course, if you can track people with their phones or through the internet, that becomes much easier than it used to be.
That kind of, oh, go ahead.
No, I'm kind of still stuck on the definition of tyrant. I kind of want to go back to that because that was also, when we posted this on YouTube, the first, 20 comments were just like people naming tyrants, like who they thought was a tyrant.
Yeah.
We got Justin Trudeau in there, which I'd like to
I think the Canadians are unhappy with politics these days.
In other words, I want to talk a little bit about how subjective it is, but then how maybe some clear examples so that people, where most people can be on the same page, because the word tyrant comes, did a little research just to clear my own head about like what is a tyrant. It comes from Greek, and Plato was talking about tyrant. And this was back, Plato wasn't pro-democracy. So he was saying a tyrant was a bad authoritarian, whereas a king was a good authoritarian. So even before the idea of democracy set hold in Western society, the idea of tyrant was already there. So who in your mind stands out as like, okay, this is a tyrant and everybody can basically agree except maybe him and his 3 deputies?
So the way that I look at this is political systems exist on a spectrum. So on the one hand of the spectrum, you have something like North Korea, and on the other hand, you have the most democratic society imaginable. And what differentiates these political systems is the share of people that you need to maintain the support from in order to take power or to maintain power. So somebody like Kim Jong-un in North Korea, he only needs the support of, let's say, 100 families in Pyongyang. And if he loses that support, he's going to lose power and he might lose his life. If you are, on the other hand, let's say, Luxembourg, right? You need a huge share of the population in order to maintain power because you need to win elections. And that has a massive impact on the way that you govern. So what I'm looking at really is sort of towards the North Korea side of the spectrum. I'm looking at societies where you only need very few people as a proportion in order to take power and to maintain power.
But then do you differentiate between states like North Korea that he's extremely authoritarian, maybe his grip on power depends on a few people, but it also, North Korea has had a long, stable history of authoritarianism since the Korean War. Whereas when you look at some states in, I don't know, in Africa, for example, that were left in a state of anarchy after colonialism, and then you had rapid transfers of power where a warlord could overnight become the leader of the country. Those are obviously different cases, right?
Yeah, they are different cases, but they also have things in common. So when you talk about those cases in Africa, for example, part of the reason why they frequently had these changes of regime is because they relied only on a very small share of the population to maintain power. And this sounds good in a sense, but the flip side of that is if you lose the support of those very few people, you will also lose power. So, you know, these systems that I'm looking at, they can be rich or poor, they can be mountainous or flat. There are a lot of differences between them and also the way the political systems function. But what they have in common is how many people you need in order to maintain power. And the other thing that they have in common, which I should also mention, is the risk of what is called the post-tenure fate of these political leaders. So if you imagine somebody like Olaf Scholz, or you imagine somebody like Keir Starmer in the UK, when these leaders lose power, they will be fine. Okay, they might give speeches to banks, or they might spend some time with their family. They're going to be okay. But when
Angela Merkel said she just wanted to take a nap.
Angela Merkel is okay. She's writing a book. You know, it's fine. But when you look at the other end of that spectrum, personalist dictators, the outlook is very, very different. So studies have shown that more than 2/3 of personalist dictators are either forced into exile, imprisoned, or killed once they lose power. So if you are one of these tyrants, you operate in a system whereby a small number of people could topple you. And if you do lose power, you might end up in a jail or you might end up being killed. And of course, these leaders don't read studies, you know, but they know, they instinctively know that there's a massive risk to doing this kind of work. And that's logical also, right? Because to stay in power in these systems, you have to harass your opponents. You might be torturing them. You might also be killing people. So you have a lot of enemies. And when you are no longer at the levers of power, all of that can come back to bite you.
Can I ask a question about when you're saying leaders like Kim Jong-un need the support of a small number of people and to stay in power, does that automatically mean that their own grip on power is more fragile than we might assume it to be?
That's a good question.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, okay, so we know from research that regimes can be more durable than leaders. So I should explain that a little bit. So there are two things to look at here. One is the leader himself. So in my book, this would be the tyrant. So this would be Kim Jong-un. And then there's the regime. And the regime is not just one person, but it's a system. And one way to look at the regime are the rules through which a new leader gets chosen. So even though Kim Jong-un is the third person in the family, so to speak, to be in power, it's still the same regime because the way that new leaders are chosen has not changed.
Yeah.
But when you have, for example, a military coup, and then you have a revolution, and then you have a democracy, those will be three different regimes because the way that these leaders get chosen are different. So it's important to differentiate between just that one person and the regime as a whole.
Yeah.
But to answer your question, it is very difficult to judge the stability of these regimes from the outside, and sometimes even from the inside, because they can look totally stable, but then, you know, within the blink of an eye, you do have that mass protest, or you do have that general deciding that they will try a military coup, and then all of a sudden, the system crumbles. And this is also something that differentiates these systems from democracies, because in democracies, usually, there's an orderly process. You know, you have regular elections. Sometimes you even have term limits. So you sort of know what is going on. And these types of regimes are a lot less predictable.
Can you give an example of that where a ruler lost power and their regime crumbled? I mean, just to give our viewers like an idea of exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, so there are plenty. So let's say Ceausescu in Romania, right? Towards the end of the Cold War, Ceausescu, who had been in power for a long time in Romania, got up on a balcony and he gave a speech, right, in front of a big, big crowd because there had been turmoil in Romania for quite a while.
Right.
And he thought, okay, look, I'm going to go out, I'm going to reassure the people, it's going to be fine. I've survived in power before. And what he found is people started booing. and he couldn't even comprehend what was happening, because he was the genius of the Carpathian Mountains, so, and he had been for so long. But ultimately what happened was he needed to flee in a helicopter, and then he couldn't get into exile in time. So after the military changed sides, he got found and he got executed together with his wife.
He was found on his way out of the country, basically.
Yeah,
it was a bloody end. It's like the Hunger Games. The odds are not in their favor in terms of the percentage. You said 2/3. I'm wondering, anything in comments yet so far or questions for our expert?
I think there is still a big debate here on who are we to decide who is a tyrant and who's not. I think there's some concern here that there's a little bit of Western chauvinism involved in deciding what is an autocracy and what is not. We had a comment from Be Polite. The West establishes autocracies that they need, like Egypt. They gave that example. Or
even Saudi Arabia, the theocracy.
Nathan Steinhauser says, are they considering America an autocracy as well? This is a typical neoliberal definition of democracy. Democrat or Republican, no policy changes are possible. That's not a democracy. That's from the Vinyl Dreamscape. So I think you have given a pretty clear example of tyranny, but I think a lot of people do sense that there's a little bit of subjectivity in deciding what is and what isn't.
I think one thing is, just if I can weigh in, is just the outcomes, right? If you look at United States and its foreign policy, around the world, it is the cause of much death and destruction, and many people would consider what the United States has done overseas evil. But that doesn't necessarily mean the person in charge who's making these decisions is a tyrant. And I think maybe from just what I'm hearing in terms of the comments, a lot of people are thinking about the outcomes as the definition of the tyrant. And what I'm hearing, at least from you, is that in democracies, the person in charge might walk away from power after their term ends, and that's how we define it. We're not necessarily saying democracies are not evil or not problematic or not bad. This is just one kind of system and
of course,
leadership you're looking at. Yeah.
So that's exactly right. There are plenty of these types of systems that are supported by Western liberal democracies, right? Egypt is a good example. Saudi Arabia is also a good example. And like you say, of course, democratic leaders can commit war crimes. They can do terrible things. They can kill civilians. That's not the differentiator. So they can absolutely be cruel. But what is different about these systems is, like I said, how they get power and how they maintain power. So if you look at somebody like Olaf Scholz, all debates, the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, or pick any other democratic leader, will have an extremely hard time governing against the vast majority of the population for an extended period. Because eventually there will be an election, and that might mean that that person will get voted out. If you are this type of leader, your incentives are exactly the other way around. If you have money coming in, you have no incentive to spend it on schools or on railways or on hospitals for the majority of the population, because the majority of the population really does not matter. So the more academic term for this would be the selectorate. So, who are the people that keep leaders in power? Right? And you can even differentiate between the nominal selectorate and the real selectorate. So there are people that keep you in power in theory and people that keep you in power in practice. So if you look at the United States, for example, theoretically, everybody, or just about everybody over the age of 18 is part of the selectorate because they can vote, most of them at least, right? But in theory, the group is smaller, because really only the voters in a few swing states can make a critical difference as to whether you're going to keep power or not, right? So the real group of people that selects the new leader is smaller. And then, of course, you can make the argument, and this is fair, that, okay, well, what about lobbyists, right? They might give you the money that you need in order to convince these people. That's all totally fair. But to take it back in history, for example, just to provide an extreme point of how this can also work, I looked at a Tsar of the Russian Empire who lost power, and he lost power at the hands of his wife, right? Who later became known as Catherine the Great. So in these types of systems, sometimes it's enough for even one person that might even be in your family to lose faith in you and try to depose you. And if that person can then convince a few soldiers or guardsmen to topple you, then you're going to have a bad time. And he did. He was imprisoned, and shortly thereafter he died. So even though democracies are far from perfect, there's still a structural difference in the way they operate. And this structural difference leads to very different incentives for leaders once they are in power.
Can I ask a question about this sort of power imbalance? Because you're sort of saying in autocracies, the threat to the person comes from the people closest to them rather than the ordinary person. You combine that, say, with laws that crack down on dissent against ordinary people, prohibiting them from protesting and demonstrating. In situations like that, what is the power of ordinary people to change things? It seems like it's greatly diminished.
Yes. So the main threat to these types of leaders does not come from the masses in the streets, but as I put it in the book, the people that smile at them as they walk along the corridors. So it's just sort of palace elites, and it's the generals and the men with guns. But that doesn't mean that the masses are completely powerless. And in fact, there is a way in which they can bring down even some of these most entrenched leaders, but it's indirect.
Okay.
So nonviolent resistance has something called a participation advantage. So if I ask you to join a protest and I say, look, it's going to be peaceful, we're not going to throw any Molotov cocktails, you might say yes. And just about everybody can join these types of opposition campaigns. If I were to tell you, look, how about we start a guerrilla movement? I'm going to give you a Kalashnikov and we go out into the jungle and we do whatever we can to bring down this leader. You would probably be more reluctant to join because it's more difficult. It sounds a lot more dangerous. So when you use nonviolence, you can oftentimes bring out a lot of people into the street. And as you get more people into the street, regimes can be forced into a decision whether they want to use force or not. And really, in German, we say it's a choice between the plague and cholera. Right. So there are no good options because you want to look strong, so you don't want to allow protests against your regime. But if you use violence in order to put down these protests, you might get a backlash and you might get more people into the street and more people into the street. And eventually, you might arrive at a point where you tell your security forces to use serious violence. So no more batons, but bullets or tanks. And this is a point at which protesters can get regimes to crumble under the weight of their own repression.
Right.
Because not everybody's going to go along. Some people are going to say, look, I've been trained to fight on behalf of this country. I'm not going to shoot at women and children. And this is what you want. A peaceful protest works by cracking the regime.
This is obviously a huge risk in a country like Syria, as opposed to where nonviolence originated in India with Gandhi leading a nonviolent movement because the British Raj was based on this myth that they were the moral authority in the country, and they had a democratic electorate back home who was watching the events unfold, and public opinion was very much in favor of not shooting civilians in the head. Maybe not in favor in the beginning, but it didn't take as long to convince the British population and the Indians that something was terribly wrong there. Whereas what happened in Syria, that's exactly how it started. The students went to the streets non-violently. Yep. They were brutally crushed by the Assad regime, and yet Assad is still in power.
Yeah, do they work, I guess? There's a few good examples, India. We can also talk about Bangladesh very recently.
I'm wondering have you studied what happened in Syria, and maybe do you have a theory of why that didn't work?
So first do they work? So that depends a little bit on what we mean by work, because work can mean are they able to bring down these regimes, and it can also mean what happens after the regime is brought down. So we know from the research that if they do work, they are comparatively good at leading to a sustainable outcome. So you have a much, much higher chance of achieving a genuine democracy if you are able to bring down these regimes without force than you would have with force.
I think you had a percentage mentioned in your book, and we actually pulled it out. Wade, in the control room, I don't know if you can play that video clip separately, but I'll just quote it. The successful nonviolent uprisings lead to democracy almost 10 times more often than violent ones, 57% versus 6%. And actually, it's a slate of information that we prepared. Between 1950 and 2012, 65% of autocrats were removed by regime insiders. And then the next one, sorry, I went backwards, but 69% of tyrants end up in prison, go into exile, or are killed, as you mentioned. And then the third one is regarding that nonviolent uprisings, 10 times more likely to lead to democracy, 57% versus 6%. I feel like I hijacked the question a little bit. Let's go back to Syria.
But if you want to respond to that.
But the problem, of course, is this is if they are successful. And that's the key here. Because there are some societies in which it is realistic to bring down a tyrant through nonviolent protests, and there are some societies in which it is not. So let's say we take North Korea again, but you could also take something like Russia. It is extremely difficult for people to mobilize because these regimes have done almost everything they can in order to prevent popular mobilization. So if I were to start a protest in, let's say, Pyongyang, I would probably be alone because I would have very little way of actually connecting with other people that might have grievances with the regime. And even if I got out 100 people in Pyongyang, it is quite unlikely that the protest would spread to other cities because, again, the regime controls television, the regime controls the radio, and it is very difficult for North Koreans to even access, free internet of any kind. So you're right to say that this doesn't always work. And I think when it comes to Syria, this is another one of those very uncomfortable truths, because we tend to think of conflict as being won through winning the hearts and minds of the population. And to us, to an extent, that is true, because democracies are constrained. So yes, the leaders might be cruel, yes, they might commit war crimes, but it is much more difficult for them to use that type of violence against their own people or anybody else than a dictator, right? And the truth is that if dictators can sustain the use of brutal violence for an extended period of time, they can win. It doesn't mean that their population likes them. In fact, millions of people might want them gone. But if you are strong enough and if you can sustain that repression for long enough, you can maintain power. And that's especially the case if you have foreign support. In this case, Russia, for example. And this also links back to the regime potentially cracking under the weight of its own repression. Because if you are, let's say, an officer in the Syrian military and you ask yourself whether to execute that order and execute people, or you don't, you will look at the probability of the regime winning or the regime losing. Because, of course, nobody wants to be on the losing side, because, again, for that officer, being on the losing side can mean losing his life. And if he knows that the Russian military is going to come in to assist, victory for Assad is going to be much more likely. So a lot of this is about perceptions, but like I said, depressingly, a lot of it is also about force.
Did it matter in Syria what the potential outcome was if Assad fell? I mean, we did see a lot of the fighting that happened in 2013. ISIS became a threat to the region, and a lot of people might have seen that as the alternative to Assad's regime, something even more brutal. So in that case, did it matter that Assad, for some people, represented the lesser of two evils?
Yeah, I think, I'm quite skeptical of using force to try to change regimes in general. And, the statistical track record of, foreign imposed regime change is atrocious. So a study looked at US-led regime change operations over a century, and it found that in 11% of cases, it led to democracy. So barely more than 1 in 10.
Is that why the United States, generally speaking, stopped or slowed down that trend?
Well, I think that, in a way, links back to the selectorate, right? So I think in the US, it's now more difficult to go to war because a lot of the people that you depend on in order to win that next election are tired of going to war. Right? So you have to be more responsive to your population in that system than you would have to be in another system. But so generally speaking, I'm skeptical, right? But of course, there is a point at which the costs are so high and the suffering is so great that perhaps this is a risk worth taking, right? And also, I mean, look, I had the luxury of reading a lot of books, talking to a lot of people and doing a lot of research, but all of this is based on probabilities, right? And if you actually sit in that situation room and you get that report, listen, this or that dictator is about to barrel bomb a hospital or a bazaar, how do you decide? I think it's essentially an impossible decision.
We kind of danced around this, but let's just spend a little bit of time talking about Russia. Because you were talking about Russia's ability to suppress protests, but at least a few years ago, we had Navalny, who, when he was still alive, trying to run an opposition election campaign against Putin, and he was actually encouraging ordinary Russian citizens to take to the streets in their city. And at some point, we had cities, not just in Moscow and St. Petersburg, but all over the country where people were turning out to protest. Can you talk a little bit about that? I believe the regime has gotten tougher on protests, so it's less likely to see the kind of visuals that we're seeing play today. But how might, well, first of all, number one, Navalny and opposition figures like him and the prospects of seeing more of that, and then second of all, how might Putin's regime end?
Yeah, so when you look at the Russian system, it has gotten more repressive over time, and it has succeeded in making the prospect of a popular uprising less and less likely. Partly through the legal system, by making it more difficult for non-governmental organizations to operate, partly by sending people into jail, poisoning people, assassinating them, forcing them into exile, and so forth. And leaders like Putin really are obsessed with this idea of the masses coming to get them. And they're telling, of course, it's not just ordinary Russian people, but it's, the CIA is behind it, and, these are the people that really sort of decide what happens. So they spend a lot of time, a lot of resources on trying to diminish that threat. And in the case of Russia, unfortunately, they have been quite successful. So now, for a Russian person somewhere in Yekaterinburg or somewhere like that to go out and protest is extremely risky. They could go to jail. The people they love could be harassed. So they've really upped that cost of participating. And of course, if you are harsh enough as a regime and you are able to do it, then slowly but surely that participation advantage that we just talked about evaporates, right? Because at an extreme end, nobody is going to go to a protest if they think they will die. We're not quite there yet in Russia, but very few people will go if they think they go to prison either.
I want to read something from your book, actually. You have a quote that begins a chapter here. History, this is from another person, I won't say who yet. History proves that all dictatorships, all authoritarian forms of government are transient. Only democratic systems are not transient. Whatever the shortcomings, mankind has not devised anything superior. Who was that?
Who said
Vladimir Putin. So what happened there? You talked about how the crackdown, but what is your theory about what caused him? Maybe this is cynical and he never intended to have a democracy, but he did inherit a democracy and its transition to something like an autocracy. Why is the question?
I can't look into Vladimir Putin's head, of course, but if I had to bet, I would say that was, cynical even then. But I'm quite cynical about a lot of political leaders in general. I think oftentimes if they can expand their power, they will try to expand their power. And, especially in a system like Russia, where you have to do quite a few illegal things, quite a few terrible things in order to maintain power, I think the risk of losing power becomes ever greater and you're being forced into the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. But what he says, of course, in a sense is true. Because one of the things that these types of political systems really, really struggle with is succession. So they can look very stable for an extended period of time. And some of them manage successions, like the North Koreans, for example. But in general, succession is a huge weakness of dictatorships, especially in comparison to democracies.
Can I ask you about that? Because you've said that Vladimir Putin has no interest in grooming a successor. Why doesn't he have an interest in grooming one?
Yeah, so imagine yourself in a dictatorial palace, and even though you haven't read the studies or you haven't read the book, you know that if you lose power, you will probably be screwed.
Yeah.
So you have a huge incentive in order to try to stay in power for as long as you possibly can. And the problem with, building up some sort of successor is that you build up an alternative power center. And you don't want an alternative power center because if you get things even slightly wrong, you risk giving somebody who is already powerful a massive incentive to take you out. And this is not a theoretical concern. This is something that has plagued even European monarchies, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And this has very real consequences even now. So if you look at something like North Korea, for example, the way that nuclear weapons are managed, for example, are deliberately very, very much controlled just by Kim Jong-un. So even if he's not around, the power is not devolved to some other leader as it would be in a democracy. And that means that if crisis ever were to arrive, the chance of something going catastrophically wrong are much higher than they would be. And that also links back to this idea that you don't want a successor.
Now, in terms of a successor, though, actually, Putin doesn't have a clear successor. Neither does China's Xi Jinping. But with North Korea, it's a little funny, isn't it? Kim Jong-un seems to very much favor his daughter, who's far too young to be a leader. But he certainly is promoting her through propaganda in a way that makes it clear that he intends for her to take over power. What's the, I mean, I know you can't get into his head, but why is he doing this versus why Putin and Xi aren't doing that is a fascinating thing, right?
Yeah, so the argument in favor of doing something like that is that if you feel like you have to choose somebody, it is good to choose somebody from the family. The first factor in this is loyalty, right? So, I mean, you know, blood is thicker than water. A lot of us would probably be more likely to trust family than other people. But the second factor, and we've seen this in other countries, including Syria, for example, is that the regime elites that keep the regime sort of, you know, moving along are oftentimes able to agree to, you know, successors from the family because they think that successors from the family will be more likely to keep the regime alive. Because what interests these palace elites and these generals is not necessarily who the leader is, but they're interested in the continuation of the regime, because it is the regime that gives them money, that gives them power. So what they really want to avoid is a scenario where, you know, there's a free-for-all, you know, where disputes sort of spill over into the street, and then you might even have something like a civil war. So if you feel like you have to come up with some sort of successor, or you want to for some other reason, usually somebody in the family is a good bet.
Can I ask you a bit more about that? If you can go into, just drill into that answer a little bit more. What are the consequences for a country? So we're not talking about the elites, but the general population. If an autocrat or a tyrant dies or is removed from power and there is no clear chosen person to replace them, what are the implications for the everyday person?
Yeah, so again, the research shows that the likelihood of a fallen autocratic leader translating into democracy is very low. It's around 20%. Right. So usually when a dictatorship crumbles, when a dictator falls, the outcome is not great. Doesn't mean it never happens, but oftentimes it is very bad. And partly that is precisely because of this question of succession. So if you're a personalist dictator and you create the entire system to evolve around you, and you try to centralize as much power as you possibly can, when you are no longer around because you've been killed or because you had a heart attack or because you got cancer, then it is a lot more likely for the system to crumble than it would in a democracy, for example. And that can often lead to a situation where, you know, the big man is no longer around. And as a result of that, fighting breaks out between other groups that might want to take power. So a good example of this is Sudan at the moment, for example, where, you know, the dictator was ousted. People were celebrating in the street because they thought everything would get better. But instead of transitioning to democracy, we now have a situation where different men with guns are essentially vying for control over the country. And that has spilled over into, you know, hundreds of thousands of people, I think maybe even millions having to flee, and, you know, attack helicopters being used on innocent civilians.
And this term men with guns is one that you do use because you say you believe that the most likely scenario when we're talking about Russia is that men with guns will decide to remove Putin because they feel they could gain more power or wealth by doing so. I just want to ask you one more question about, you mentioned sickness and cancer in that answer there. How important is safeguarding information about a tyrant's or an autocrat's personal health? Because if they're sick, could that be perceived as being a weakness by the elites and by the wider population?
Absolutely. So you never want to look weak as a dictator. You never, never, never want to look weak. And the reason why a lot of these dictators are very, very protective of their health is because it relates back to the expectations of the elites. So if you're one of those generals and you've always wanted to take power, and now you hear, okay, well, the dictator has a heart disease. Right. He's going to live for, 9 months max, okay? You are going to change your calculus. Right. You might think, well, he's not going to be around for much longer. I'm not going to do his bidding anymore. Now that he is weak, I'm going to strike. I am going to try to take power. So that is why you see a lot of these leaders, keeping things on the wraps, maybe getting their treatment abroad. They desperately want to avoid a situation where they look weak.
There have been examples of leaders trying to hide their health complications, and then they kind of disappeared, and there was speculation whether or not they were alive. I can't remember which examples occurred recently, but how do they survive something like that? Once nobody really knows if you're alive or not, how is that not the end of your autocratic rule?
With Robert Mugabe, right? There was a lot of times where he was kind of going to England for treatment, if I remember correctly, and things like that, and would only be found out
Right,
afterwards.
and you would think you would lose your power if nobody knew if you were dead or alive.
Yeah. Well, I think it certainly makes it more likely. You know, like none of this at the end of the day is certainty, right? There's always, it's going to make it more likely that people move against you, but they don't have to.
Yeah, and there was also the case when Xi Jinping disappeared for about 12 days at some point, I think, or even longer. And people suspected that was he alive or dead was a question. Was he sick? How was he sick? It was probably just surgery. He eventually, of course, reemerged. But during that time, it was extremely tense in China. So the health of the leader is very important. Dustin, I actually did want to turn to you at this point to ask you what's happening in chat, if there's anything trend-wise that we're getting or hearing from people?
Yeah, people are very much stuck on the question of is this a way for the West to criticize the world? And there's also a lot of people who want to move away from that discussion. So there's kind of two sides to this. Lemming, for example, makes the point that, we need some definition to work with. And obviously, Marcel is an academic, is going to have a definition for us that we'll work with in this show. So I see you there, Lemming. Thank you for trying to engage in a discussion in the chat. Someone mentioned religion, which I found interesting. What role does religion play for these autocratic leaders? And we also had a little discussion about can people protest in their own countries? Rafi came back and said, they protest every day in India, and he does feel safe to protest. And that's kind of the piece in this protest chaos.
Well, speaking of... sorry.
Yeah, I thought maybe we could end on the religion question. I thought that might be an interesting point for you, Marcel, to give us some input to.
As it relates, actually, when you get the chance to, if we can just touch on Iran a little bit.
Sorry, I forgot one thing. Marcel, you got a couple of 100 emojis, which I think people use to tell you, they agree with you. So I did not want to forget about that.
Let's talk about Iran. And actually, on that note, let me just, if I may, let's just start with a video message that was posted just a few days ago, not by someone from Iran, but by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. This was a message he posted essentially to the people of Iran, and he essentially is calling for regime change. Just take a listen to this clip.
But you know one simple thing. Iran's tyrants don't care about your future, but you do. When Iran is finally free, and that moment will come a lot sooner than people think, everything will be different. Don't let a small group of fanatic theocrats crush your hopes and your dreams. You deserve better. Your children deserve better. The entire world deserves better.
And of course, that's happening in the context of Israel and Iran very close to the brink of all-out war. And nevertheless, I was listening to it, and it sounds sounds a lot like a throwback to President George Bush Jr. And that era of American adventurism in Iraq and Afghanistan. Do you think what Netanyahu is calling for here is realistic? And how do you think what's happening in the Middle East region, including a potential Israeli attack, strong attack on Iran, might influence domestic politics there in this theocracy?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on Israeli domestic politics, but I get the sense...
domestic politics of Iran in terms of people rising up.
Yeah. Well, I think, when I see that quote, I think it's probably to position himself towards, Israeli domestic politics and perhaps also with an ear to support us in the US.
Right.
I think when it comes to regime change in Iran, obviously, again, the men with guns are a big threat, but the leaders in Tehran have understood that. And that is why they've structured their security forces in a way that makes a military coup less likely. So we haven't talked about this, but what you want to avoid if you are that type of regime is a scenario in which one general can decide to take you out and then go along with it. You want to have a situation where everything is split into smaller pieces. So you don't have a unified military, but instead you have your regular military, then you have a parallel military force, and then maybe you have a militarized palace guard. So the Iranians, for example, you've got your regular military, you've got your revolutionary guards, and so forth, right? And the reason why they structure it that way is because it helps them to stay in power. Because if a regular general decides to go through with a military coup, he will know that he might have to go through the Revolutionary Guards. And he probably won't want that, so it makes it less likely. So coups, always a threat, but they've prepared. I think the weakness of the Iranian regime is that protest, to some extent, is still possible, right? So they've obviously also tried to curtail it, and they've been willing to use brute force against protesters in the past. But unlike in something like North Korea, there's still the possibility that it could erupt in the future. And that, to me, seems a lot more likely than Israelis or Americans bringing about some sort of regime change in Tehran.
Here's one reason why I kind of am following the chat in this line of thinking that we can't really separate what democracies do from what tyrants do. And it's not because I believe that the U.S. is a tyranny. We have free speech, even more than in Germany in some circumstances. It is a free society in terms of the context of history. But what concerns me is that the actions of countries like the U.S. do have an effect on the actions of countries like Iran. Iran went from having a Shah that was supported by the U.S. They had a revolution, a popular revolution, that then led to the Ayatollahs, to the Islamic Republic. So in some sense, it wasn't a fluke of history. It wasn't a madman who came to power and then is supporting himself through like grift. Maybe it's losing support recently because of its authoritarianism, but in a way, it's always positioned itself as we're here, we're a strong authoritarian regime that's going to protect you from Western influence because we want to make our own decisions. So my question is, the attempt to overthrow Iran, the attempt to maybe easier examples in South America, Central America, where the U.S. followed its own interests, put pressure on democratically elected governments to do the bidding of the U.S. Doesn't this, in a way, create a situation where the only option for a country is to have a repressive regime in order to resist global powers? It's not just the U.S. doing it, but Russia, China, these are great powers that want to use smaller countries in some instances as their pawns. And in order for a pawn to assert its authority, sometimes strong men are encouraged to stay in power in order to do the bidding of what they think, anyway, is the national interest.
Yeah. I mean, of course, look, democracies will try to pursue their perceived national interests, just like other countries. And oftentimes they get it wrong and they do terrible things. And, part of the reason why these regime change wars, for example, have often failed to create democracy is because that wasn't the core interest of the intervening state in the first place, right? So if you're a democracy, and again, you rely on a large number of people in order to stay in power as a leader, it is very difficult to make the case to go abroad and go to war solely or primarily to bring democracy to a place. Usually that's not enough. So there needs to be something more important to their country, like national security, like control of natural resources and so forth. So particularly during the Cold War, but also after, there were a bunch of interventions where the democratic leaders on TV would have said, yeah, this is about democracy, but quite clearly it wasn't about democracy.
But
right?
my question is more from the perspective of the citizens of an authoritarian regime. When you have a CIA assassination or an extrajudicial killing carried out by a Western power, doesn't this actually reinforce the authoritarian regime by creating this national myth that we're here and we have to be strong, we have to spy on you because we have CIA agents in our country trying to take us down?
To what extent, I mean, that connects to nationalism, right? Essentially, nationalism is a tool of repression.
No, of course. And I mean, I talk about sort of the decolonization process in the book a little bit. And I think, yes, you're absolutely right that sometimes it gives these leaders an excuse and, it allows them to portray themselves as strong leaders that are withstanding foreign pressure and so forth. But when it comes to the process of decolonization, for example, the ex-colonial powers effectively set up these new regimes to not be stable, right? And one of the ways that they did that is through the way that they structured the military during colonial times. So what these European empires did, for example, is they always made sure that no single ethnic group was ever in control of the civil service and the security forces at the same time. Because if that had been the case, they would have been able to resist much more effectively. So they always try to split, not just when it came to borders, but also when it came to the structure of these regimes.
I think you give the example of India in your book, right? With
India, martial race, but also in Africa. And that created, and at the same time, they rarely promoted from the local population. So they wanted local soldiers because that made it easier to maintain the colonies. But they didn't want locals in any kind of leadership position because, again, that could become a threat. So if you're now an independence leader and you've come to power, what do? You can't trust your military because there are very few people that, that have been brought up into leadership position from that country. And things are designed to not be stable by the colonial powers. And that led them to then make decisions that created more and more instability and made democracy less and less likely.
I actually see a question, if we can bring it in, from one of the people in chat, since we're kind of touching on the United States and some of the hypocrisy. Roland OM asking, can Donald Trump be considered a tyrant for ruling the U.S. without considering the majority of the U.S.'s population's point of view and mainly making decisions based on what he wanted to do? I guess he's either talking about his first term or the expected potential win of Donald Trump. He is very autocratic-like or tyrant-like. What's your prognosis on that?
I mean, it's quite clear to me that Donald Trump's preferred system of government would not be a democracy. I think if he had his will, he would create something very different, probably a dictatorship. So when I look at the US, what I'm really interested in are the institutions that could constrain him, right? So what are the Republicans going to do? What are the courts going to do? How's the military going to react? How would the intelligence services react? And I think your prognosis of how things are going to go will depend on your answer to those questions. And I think some of them, like Republicans, might be less likely to be constrained than other actors.
Within the U.S. context, I think one counter-argument to that would be that we have a democracy, but we have a structure in place that you can go out on the streets, you can protest, but nothing much changes because there's very established institutions that have a way of doing things. We have two parties. We can't get rid of the two-party system because of the way the Constitution is written, and the only people who can rewrite the Constitution are the two powers. So then you have somebody like Donald Trump step up and say, I am against this whole system. I represent the will of the people. And in that sense, I think his supporters would say that he's the opposite of a tyrant. He's somebody who's doing the will of the people despite these ingrained institutions that make it impossible for any kind of fluke in the system.
Yeah, I think it's not just in the US. I think there's a widespread sense in democracies that our systems are paralyzed, that nothing gets done. Trains don't work, schools aren't as good as they used to. It takes a long time to get an appointment, with a doctor. And then at the same time, I think people look at somebody like Putin or they look at somebody like Xi Jinping and they think, look, this is what we need. We need somebody to actually make a call and then go through with it. But the problem is, even aside from how legitimate it might be, that the outcomes created by these systems tend to just be worse, right? There are outliers. There are some societies that are not democratic.
Singapore.
Where a lot of people, have gotten more wealthy, where there is prosperity, where the government has delivered for a lot of people. But by and large, these systems are worse. So, if you think that your clinic or your school is in a bad shape now, it's not going to get better when you have a dictator in power.
So in other words, to make an obvious point, that a tyrant could actually get into power by promising to represent the will of the people against a regime that doesn't have a tyrant but is maybe repressing certain voices in the country, right?
Yeah, you could do.
Yeah, I wanted to say, because you were just talking about these outliers, countries that maybe work well as a autocracy or in an autocratic form. The chat has a theory on that. Some people in the chat were thinking that maybe some cultural factors could play a role there, and maybe some cultures lend themselves more towards being democratic or not. I have one member, for example, who said that he's from India and he really feels that his culture is made for a democracy. The Indian culture really works well with democracies. I wonder, is the opposite? Could the opposite also be true?
Yeah, I mean, the Chinese government definitely pushes that propaganda that the Chinese people, there's too many of them. 1.4 billion, can't do democracy, culturally not inclined, not in an individualistic society, and much more of a collectivist society. So let's just stick with the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. I've certainly heard the opposite of what the account user from India has said. Do you believe in that cultural?
No. I'm skeptical of that. I've also heard that, but I'm skeptical of that argument. I think everybody deserves a say in the way that they are governed. And of course, the CCP would say people have a say, but they don't really. So, what exact form that takes, it's up to people to decide. I mean, there are very, very different democracies. Switzerland works very differently from Germany. Germany works very differently from some other country. So, there's not an exact prescription. It doesn't have to be this or that. But I think people do have to have a meaningful say. And the other thing that I would say about some of these outliers, who's telling us that Singapore would be poorer if they were a genuine democracy? Who's telling us that the Chinese wouldn't be as wealthy as they are now if that country were a democracy.
Counterfactual. Right? Actually, on a per capita basis, if you compared the PRC, the People's Republic of China, with the ROC, Republic of China, which is actually Taiwan, the per capita in terms of GDP is higher in Taiwan. The average Taiwanese is wealthier than the average Chinese.
Yeah. So I'm strongly in favor of democracy, and in that sense, the book is normative. In general, I've tried to not tell people what should be done or what shouldn't be done. I've just tried to show some trade-offs. But if you are looking for a book that is opposed to democracy, this is not it.
Why do you think so many, the polls are showing globally that young people, Gen Z, have a much lower faith in democracy these days, and you explained some of the reasons, the inability for infrastructure to work as well as they did 30 years ago, health systems and so on. But where do you think democracies have failed? Is it part of it is in civics education and messaging?
I think, again, that might be one of those comfortable lies that we tell ourselves. I think paralysis, like I said, is one factor. I think another one is just a sense of things just getting worse. I think when my parents' generation grew up, they had the feeling, okay, things might not be great right now, but things are steadily getting better. I don't have that feeling. I feel like a lot of things are just constantly getting worse, and it is very difficult to stop it. And I also think there's a sense of powerlessness. So to give you one example, I think globalization is a great thing. I think the European Union is a great thing. But obviously, a lot of times now, decisions in a country like Germany, for example, are taken at a level that is so far removed from ordinary citizens that they feel like they can't really change anything, even if they wanted to. And it's not just politics. There's also these big companies. You see tech companies seemingly doing whatever the hell they want. Nobody stops them. So I think, it's that paralysis. It's the sense that things might not be getting better, and also a sense of powerlessness.
I wonder if, I always come back to the global aspect here, but in times of global conflict, people are looking for protection. Even in the US, even in democracies, Ukraine suspended elections during the war. It's impossible really to have an election during wartime. Every country, no matter how democratic they are, acknowledges that when you have a major threat to the existence of your country, you can't really deal with polling and all the difficulties that come with a well-maintained democracy. So maybe, what do you feel about that? That global conflict and this kind of insecurity with clashes, the realignment, so to say, in global politics is having an effect on people's opinion of democracy? Yeah,
I think people price security higher. I think your average voter is now a lot more interested in just raw sort of physical security than the voter would have previously been. And that obviously makes it easier for a certain type of politician to make arguments in his favor, and not necessarily just democratic politicians. So I think fear in general is really dangerous because it paves the way for some of these non-democratic leaders. And of course, it reinforces each other, because if you have more of these types of regimes, there might also be more conflict, because democracies, for example, tend to not go to war against each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I think this is a good time to have a few more sort of questions for you, but also maybe let's check the results of the poll, Dustin, and then I think I'd be curious what your response is to the vote
So the poll, I'll remind you guys, we asked you, will there be fewer or more autocracies in the next 30 years? Almost 400 people, 398 have voted. So if 2 more people vote while I talk, then we have 400 votes. Oh yeah, there's already 1 more. Great. The results. More autocrats will emerge. 45% of people think that. Probably stay the same, and more autocracies will fail. Or it's an even split between each of them, 25%, and only 6% think that autocracies are a necessary evil.
Oh, so some good and bad there. 6% think it's a necessary evil, but the majority, or not almost 45% is not a majority, but almost half think that the world is headed to more global autocracy and tyranny.
There we go. We just hit 406 votes now, so thank you guys.
Well done.
What's your take on that? Is that your prognosis as well for the next few decades?
I think this is probably the only topic where I'm choosing to be unreasonably optimistic.
Okay.
Wow.
So, I think even when you look at something like the Arab Spring, for example, we now look at it as a failure, because even Tunisia, which looked great at some point, looked to emerge from the Arab Spring at this great liberal democracy, now is in bad shape. But I think the truth is that it is very difficult to tell at this time how it's going to go. Now it looks terrible, but perhaps in 100 years, historians look back and they say that was key in the emergence of Tunisian democracy. Because I think a lot of this is not a linear process. It doesn't go from bad to good. Sometimes things get better, then they get worse, and then they get much better. So I am choosing to be optimistic about this.
And Putin said it best, democracy is the only system that survives in the end, right?
That's probably the one thing that I agree with Putin.
Okay. But actually, just to pour a little bit of ice cold water on all of this, when we look at the trajectory of human history, though, I mean, most of our historic memory is of tyrants. I mean, democracies, it's just a very short little brief period in human civilization. So if you were betting based on those odds, then I wouldn't necessarily bet on it. But 2 questions I want to ask. One is, of all the countries we've discussed today, which one keeps you up at night in terms of being worried? So that's one.
Russia.
Why?
Well, I think it depends where you are. But, where I am in Germany, I think Russia is just the most immediate threat. And I think a lot of the things that we discuss with supporting Ukraine, for example, militarily, also links back to regime security or regime insecurity. So I think a lot about the stability of the Russian regime, how it could end, and what it might mean for us. So that keeps me up at night.
Can you give us a little insight into what your thoughts are on how it could end, or whether it will? I mean, we already had one coup attempt, the Prigozhin march on the capital, which failed. Do you feel like that came close? Is Putin unstable?
Well, I think what it shows is that, you are this dictator and you face these trade-offs. So you face these security services that could bring you down. As a result, you restructure your security forces so that you counterbalance the different types of actors by creating, for example, Prigozhin. But then, you're almost brought down by this monster that you yourself have created. So I think, to an extent, it shows exactly that type of difficult trade-off, and it shows the lack of predictability around these kinds of events. Because, of course, the day could have ended differently, right? Putin could have died. Prigozhin could have still been alive. Didn't work out that way, but it could have, right? So I think, of course, ideally, he would be brought down through popular protest because, again, best chance of a sustainable outcome. But we know from the research that is very unlikely. So it is likely to involve violence, or he might die in office, and even then you might see violence. And I think that could be a very risky period, not just for Russians, but also for us.
In the beginning, you said your tightest definition of a tyrant is somebody who's governing with only a small percentage of the population, but in Russia, he is still very popular. He has, from a Russian perspective, done good things for the country. It is a more important country in certain respects. It has the economy is actually not doing that poorly. This is not my opinion, but this is why polls suggest that he's doing so well. So does he fit your definition of a tyrant?
Absolutely, yeah. You can still be popular, but I think the point is that he doesn't really need to be popular with your average person. So that's part of the reason why, for example, dictatorships tend to have a lower casualty sensitivity. right? So if you're a democratic leader and you send soldiers to fight and die, and they come home in sort of flag-draped coffins, you might have a serious issue. To Putin, it makes almost no difference whether somebody from a Siberian village lives or dies, because that person from that Siberian village or the family of that person has no bearing on whether Putin stays in power or not. So, yeah, he's popular, partly, of course, because he has a massive propaganda apparatus and because he uses repression to stamp out dissent. But in a sense, the only thing that matters is whether he's popular with the generals and he's popular with the rich and powerful in Moscow, because those are the people keeping him in power.
I wanted to ask you about trade-offs, but from a different perspective, and that is what countries like Germany and the US can do to weaken, if we're talking about Vladimir Putin, tyrants like him, and what can these, whatever they do, what trade-offs do they have? I mean, you dedicate part of your book to sanctions, don't you?
External factors, yeah.
External factors, exactly.
Yeah, I think, just as these tyrants face trade-offs in order to try to stay in power, we face trade-offs in trying to deal with them, right? And I think the truth is, like we've discussed, some of these tyrants are really important to us and others not so much, right? Of course, politicians will always say they want to spread democracy around the world, but in reality, the influence is limited in some places, and also the interest of these countries is limited, right? And I think depending on how strong that interest is and what leverage you might have, democracies can take different types of measures. Some of them are not very costly. For example, you can provide exile to activists or journalists, or you can, provide trainings, for example, to teach them how to create viral content for social media or what messenger apps to use and that kind of thing. And that doesn't cost a lot, neither in blood nor in treasure. But of course, that's not always going to work.
And that only has an effect up to a point, right? Like,
yes.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, and that's not going to work everywhere, right? So I think in a lot of these places, and again, this is quite depressing, sort of in the worst of the worst, outside influence tends to be quite limited. Germany is not going to bring down Kim Jong-un. Even if Germany really wanted to, and it would dedicate everything it had to bringing down Kim Jong-un, Germany will not bring him down. So if sort of the less costly ways do not take root and they're not going to do it, you then face a much more difficult set of trade-offs, because then you get to violence, essentially, right? So are you going to encourage sabotage of oil infrastructure? Are you going to provide safe houses for assassins? Are you going to try to cripple the economy and so forth, right? And these are things that have to be treated with extreme caution, because if they go wrong, they will go really, really wrong. It is very difficult for a lot of people to die because you have organized some workshops for opposition activists. But they can absolutely go wrong if somebody gets assassinated or oil pipelines start blowing up.
Yeah.
One last question maybe to end on. Carolina Vilena asks, if far-right groups become dominating, do you think that democracy could be greatly affected? I think the question here might be, is democracy under threat in Europe, do you think, from your research?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think, we spent the last decade or so talking about the death of democracy, how they die, how to prevent it. But like you said, democracy is not God-given. And throughout most of human history, we did not live in democracies. There was a colonial governor, or there was a king, or a bishop, or a sultan. So I think we need to be much more appreciative of what we have and do a much better job at defending it. But even if we do, some democracies will die. It doesn't have to be this one, it doesn't have to be the neighboring one, but the idea that no country is going to experience a reversal just makes no sense. So yes, I think democracies are under threat and some of them will die.
Well, any final thoughts from anyone? Questions, final questions?
Let me call out the users whose questions we didn't get to. Thanks so much, guys, for all these questions. It was really a lot. I had struggled keeping up in the chat. I struggled to keep up in the chat. I just want to say, Andil, Ghost Kitty, Caspian Prince, Neil S., Arthur, James, Lemming, David, all saw your questions. Sometimes it's just so many questions that we can't get all of them in, or we get the feeling that something like this has already been asked. But we do see them, and we do read them, and try to design a whole stream around that. And yeah, and I can end with another user question from Davos, who just said, I like this guy.
More of a comment, I would say.
Good. I'm glad it was useful.
Marcel, any final thoughts on your end? Or we covered a lot of ground, of course.
like I said, I think the situation is serious, but there's no reason for doom, at least when it comes to democracy. I think it's essential that we learn about these people, because if we understand them better, I think we can manage them better.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Once again, his book is out. It's called How Tyrants Fall. You can order it in the US, in the UK.
The link's in the chat as well.
And it's coming out in other languages, right? Or already has?
11 languages, yeah, next year.
Next year.
So stay tuned.
Oh, amazing, amazing. So thanks, everyone, for joining us at this week's News Desk. A little different.
We'll be back again next week. If you guys want to find out what the topic is, we're going to be posting it about 24 hours before when we go live, Wednesday, 3 p.m. European Central Time. So definitely give some comments there and some input. We always form our shows around your guys' input.
Have a good week. Bye-bye.